Hi everybody, Helle Jorgensen from Global Compact Network Canada here. Welcome to our webinar for today. I'm very excited about this, designing an anti-corruption compliance program, and actually the first of our interactive series or e-session series. Everything should have an E in front of it apparently. Welcome. As most of you know, the UN Global Compact is the world's largest sustainability initiative, backed by 13,000 CEOs globally in over 170 countries. I think today we do not have people from 170 countries on, but I think we do have a lot of people from different countries. Before I start the introduction, there is some housekeeping rules. So I hope that Aparna, if you can take me to the next slide. And in order just to tell you all that how to use the control panel. So you should be muted, all of you, by Aparna and the team. And then there is the chat box where you can write your questions, and we'll be taking the questions during the Q&A session. So with that, if I can get to the next, we have a long agenda for today, and we have some fabulous speakers. So I'll just do a very, very short introduction, and then I'll introduce the speakers, and then I'll keep quiet from my end. So if I can say in terms of the anti-corruption working group, we have had, and many of you know that the UN Global Compact is 10 principles within human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. And the 10 and the final principles of the UN Global Compact is, as I said, anti-corruption. And it states that business should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. The Global Compact Network Canada Anti-Corruption Working Group was created to address these principles, and as many of you here on this webinar will know, corruption can have a huge impact not only on business but actually on humans all around the world, environment, etc. If we look at it for companies, corruption impedes business growth, escalates costs, poses serious legal and reputational risk. It clearly also raises the transaction cost. It undermines fair competitions, impedes long-term foreign and domestic investment, and distorts development priorities. And even though I say all this, and many of us know it, it is unfortunately still a part of doing business a lot of places. We have come a long way, and I should say that many of you have heard me say that when I took my exam as public accountant, state authorized public accountant as it's called in Denmark, one of the questions was, how much can you deduct in bribe? And that was back in 97, so it's not that long ago where it was totally normal that you were bribing and that you could deduct that in tax-wise. Clearly we are in a totally different situation today. Having said that, there's still a lot of things that we could improve, and in light of this, the Global Compact Network Canada formed the working group in 2015, led by Jonathan Drimmer, and it's aiming at actually helping Canadian businesses, I would say global businesses, better address the issues surrounding corruption and compliance in that regard. The group, the working group led by Jonathan Drimmer, that we'll hear about a little bit later, decided to create an e-book, electronic, on what they viewed as some of the key areas in the field of corruption and compliance. So each chapter, and I hope most of you have had the chance to see the e-book, each chapter was written by different very experts from Global Compact companies or participants, so authors from very varied background, and the chapters ranges from overview of the jurisdictional scope of the corruption and foreign Officials Act, to managing third parties, to tone at the top, to creating appropriate anti-corruption and compliance programs for your organization as is. So it's very hands-on. The ebook was launched on March 10 as part of Transparency's International Day of Dialogue, and it has a foreword by former international chief Huguette Labelle from Transparency International. So if we can see that the ebook, the webinar today will be based on the ebook and will discuss the importance of anti-corruption compliance. I'm saying anti-compliance from time to time, anti-corruption compliance programs, and we'll also kick off our subsequent series of interactive e-sessions where the authors of all the individual chapters of the ebook will drill further into their chapters. So every month we will have that. It's training sessions almost in that regard. And the book, as many of you know, and thank you all to all our participants, all our supporters, is free and available on our website, so globalcompact.ca, and I truly urge you all to take a look at it. It is incredible, valuable resource that can aid you in the process of creating anti-corruption and compliance programs. And as mentioned earlier, we will have these monthly interactive sessions of all of the chapters of the ebook. The first one is on international investigations, reporting and auditing, will take place next month on July 13th with Mark Morrison from Blake Castles and Graydon. The team will provide more information to all of you about these sessions, the date, the timing in the coming weeks. So for now, please just ensure that you are receiving our emails, that they go to your inbox and not end up in your spam folders, because I know that that happens from time to time. So with that, let me introduce you to our panelists for the day. Many of them have worked very hard to bring this ebook forward. I have to say, Alexandra Amont, that I will start with. Alexandra, I can't say that you worked hard to bring the ebook forward because you haven't been part of the working group, but you are helping us to actually bring it forward to the trade commissioners around in the world and therefore also to the clients. So let me start by introducing Alexandra Lamont, Deputy Director, Trade Portfolio and Responsible Business Divisions from Global Affairs Canada. And Alexandra will say a few words about how Global Affairs Canada's Trade Commissioner services address corruption and governance issues. Thereafter, we will have Jonathan Drimmer. I know Jonathan do not need any introduction, but he is our chair of the Anti-Corruption Working Group. He is also the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel from Barrick Gold. He's also board member of the Global Compact Network Canada and a co-author of 2 chapters in this ebook, Risk Assessments and Policies and Procedures. Today, Jonathan will provide us with a high-level overview of the ebook, why the working group created it, and its role in the anti-corruption compliance landscape. Then we'll have, after Jonathan, we will have Pat Poitevin, the Senior Investigator and Outreach Coordinator at the RCMP. And Pat is, from time to time, saying I have to be careful here. But Pat, you're a 33-year veteran of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and have worked on proceeds of crime and fraud investigations, very thought for his knowledge on drugs, organized crime, and international corruption issues. In the session today, I'm quite sure that Pat will provide us with some enforcement perspective and the emerging legislations in the area of anti-corruption. So basically, if you don't want to have Pat visiting you, you better listen today. Next, we will have Yolanda Banks, the Senior Advisor from EDC, so Export Development Canada. And Yolanda will highlight the risk of corruption from the perspective of lending institutions, why it is important for companies to incorporate strong compliance programs, and what lending institutions such as the EDC are looking for from companies. Finally, Nina Gross, that is the Marketing Consulting Director at BDO, and Nina leads BDO's Washington, D.C. Global Forensic Practice and have 30 years of forensic accounting, investigation, and consulting experience, and working with multinational organizations and their councils. Nina was the co-author of Chapter 7, I believe, Managing Third Parties. So, as you can see, a very, very impressive panel, and this is going to be a great webinar, and then after that we'll have a lot of great sessions with a lot of diverse views and clearly, hopefully, opportunities to learn and to actually help yourself, help companies in order to have an anti-corruption program in order. So without further delay, over to Alexandra Lamont. Alexandra, can you hear me?
Hi, Alexandra, can you speak? I think Alexandra's having some troubles.
Okay, do we want to just wait and then hear from Jonathan first? I know we have a long program today, so I just don't want to wait. Jonathan, are you on? Hello. Jonathan, can I ask you to unmute yourself, please? If not, well, why don't we then go to, should we go to Yolanda? I can see Yolanda, you're ready.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me.
I can, yes.
This is Yolanda Banks from Export Development Canada. I'll jump in here. Our other presenters are just dealing with some technical difficulties. I was asked to present today on the perspectives of a financial institution, and I would first of all like to emphasize that it is just a financial institution. Export Development Canada is not representative of the whole financial sector in general. We're not a high street bank, but what we do is provide financing and insurance to companies working abroad to help promote Canadian exports and investments abroad. And in the 72 years that we've been in existence, I would say that we have seen all varieties of business deals and perhaps some that we might have wanted to walk away from and have walked away from. Corruption is an issue in international business, and as an entity of the Government of Canada, we have a standard that perhaps is higher than others that we're expected to respect. And in that regard, that's why we're looking at anti-corruption and looking at what companies can do to mitigate this risk. If I could have the next slide. I'm spending a bit of time on context because it's easier to understand our advice on anti-corruption if you understand where we're coming from. We work in almost every market around the world. About 30% of our business is derived from what we call emerging markets, or some of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China being the leaders in those markets. We are for profit, so we operate like a commercial bank, but we do respect standards that the Government of Canada has put in place for us. Next slide, please. We offer our clients various products. Largely, if you bucket them into two categories, they're financing, loans of various types, and insurance products. Next slide, please. So in that context, this is where we see Canadian companies, and they're coming to us for lending, for insurance, and yet at the same time, the Government of Canada has signed a convention with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, that imposes upon EDC the obligation to look for any signs of possible bribery, that subcategory within a larger category of corruption that may be in an international business transaction. So as a starting point, what we do is ask companies that are dealing with us to sign a declaration or an undertaking saying bribery or corruption was not involved in the business we're supporting. That is a first step. We also undertake a second step to look for due diligence to identify any signs of corruption in the business that we're supporting. Are there any red flags? Are there any signs that there's something amiss? And what are we looking for? Those red flags can be in emails. They might be in casual conversations. You would be very surprised to hear how many people mention they've been involved in a bribery scheme in order to get business. It might be a whistleblowing event, whether someone's disclosing to EDC anonymously or with their name. It could even be a complaint against a company that we're supporting. Perhaps they participated in a competitive process to get business, but one of the competitors is alleging that bribes were paid, or it could be something like a newspaper article. Another red flag for us, if I could go back to the previous slide, is a debarment by the World Bank. So if you're ineligible to participate in World Bank contracts, World Bank funded contracts, it's a red flag for us. Companies sometimes don't want to sign the anti-corruption declaration. Our due diligence might lead us to understand that a company used an agent to secure international business and the fee was extraordinarily high. For example, if the project the agent has secured was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars and their fee was 10%, that equates to tens of millions of dollars. This is a red flag. Or if the company had an agreement with the agent, if you can go around a competitive process and get us a sole source contract, your fee will be XYZ. These can raise extra questions on EDC's part. And of course, past bribery convictions are red flags. So for us, a red flag isn't prima facie reason not to deal with a company. What it does trigger is an ongoing engagement with the company to understand that flag. Why did this happen? When did it occur? What processes have you put in place to prevent, even the perception of bribery having been paid? What we also are looking for, we expect of companies, isn't a full-blown anti-corruption compliance program, but something that's scaled to the company's size and their risk profile. So if a company is 5 employees and they're exporting largely to the United States or another country seen as low risk for bribery, maybe all they have in place is, or need to have in place, is a code of conduct. If the company is larger or they're working in riskier markets, we expect something certainly more elaborate. The consequences for not having a reasonable anti-corruption compliance program in place is delays in getting insurance, delays in getting financing, and in business, as we say, time is money. So these can be very costly for a company. And ultimately, it's a potential decline by EDC to support a company that's assessed their corruption risk and has in place a good anti-corruption compliance program. Companies often ask, where can I find this? I think the e-book that the UN Global Compact has brought out is great guidance. Consult the ebook. It goes through the A to Z on how to put in place a very anti-corruption compliance program, starting from tone at the top to what do you do if you are facing an investigation, and how do you check that your programs or your steps are working. So I refer to the ebook as your guidance on what you need to have in place. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to anyone's questions. Thank you.
And do we have Alexandra on now?
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome.
Hooray. Okay. Thanks so much for being patient in the technological, just a slight challenge there in getting online, but I'm delighted to be with you. I guess I can launch in. I'll maybe launch in just to sort of provide a bit of background on who I am and our interest in this initiative. I'm the Deputy Director, as was mentioned, of the Trade Portfolio and Responsible Business Division at Global Affairs Canada. In short, we're known internally really more as our Corporate Social Responsibility Unit. And we sit in the trade operations area. And the focus of our responsibility is to support Canadian Trade Commissioners at post and also other officials, but with a focus on the Trade Commissioner service to help Canadian businesses abroad succeed with regards to responsible business conduct, which of course writ large includes both the expectation that Canadians will follow the law, all the laws of the jurisdiction they're operating in and all pertinent Canadian laws. So we have a role actually in helping enforce the CFPOA. But most of all, I think our emphasis is on trying to help Canadian companies succeed abroad, including by not engaging in corrupt activities. And so we are always on the lookout for valuable resources that might be of use to them and that will help them to succeed in challenging environments. And the ebook is certainly that. I think it's an excellent initiative, and we're going to be encouraging all our trade commissioners to follow the work that's being done here and direct their clients as far as possible to this resource on the GCNC website. So I'm delighted to form a part of this and be able to play a role in promoting it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, to the leader of the working group, Jonathan. Hope we can hear you now. Jonathan. Pat, can you hear me? Jonathan or Pat, any of you can hear me? What about you, Nina? Can you hear me?
Hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you too.
I'm sorry, it seems like we need to shuffle a little bit around here. But if we can't hear neither Jonathan or Pat, maybe we want to start with you, even though you were saying so. Yes, is that okay?
My pleasure. Okay. That is fine with me. And everyone, sorry about all the technology problems. My name is Nina Gross. I'm with BDO Consulting, and I've been in this field of anti-corruption actually for too many years. I think for many years. Hello? Thank you. And so my perspective on, and I'm a member of the working group and assisted in writing a chapter on the ebook, my perspective is somewhat different from the previous speakers. I'm a private practitioner, and I spend a good deal of my time helping companies both get out of trouble because they didn't have an adequate compliance program, and that means dealing with the DOJ and the Canadian government often, or advising them on how to build a compliance program, internal controls. So I see this very much as someone who has seen problems that have arisen in the past, and look at the ebook as something that is a really wonderful resource and primer, which I kind of wish existed for many of my clients years ago, which lays out in many different areas, from tone at the top to risk assessments to, in my chapter, third-party due diligence, some of the issues to consider as one builds a compliance program. One of the themes that's consistent across all the chapters is that we've now learned, based on our experiences working with different size companies in different countries that have different growth plans, that a compliance program needs to be very much risk-based. One size does not fit all. You want to look at the type of business you've got globally. If you're just in one country, that's going to be a different compliance program than if you're in 14 or 15 or 25 or 100 companies. What type of industry are you in? If you're in a highly regulated industry like banking, financial services, even to a large extent healthcare, that is going to be more closely scrutinized by the regulators than maybe a non-regulated industry. Do you deal with government officials in any capacity? And that's not just selling to governments as maybe the aerospace industry might or the healthcare industry might, but dealing with government officials in customs, with visas, paying taxes, promoting your goods, getting any type of government approval or permanent license. If you've got government interaction, and even more so if that interaction through a third party, your risk has been raised, your risk profile has been raised. If you're compensating people to success fees, commissions versus straight payments or salary, that also raises risk. So as you read through the ebook, you'll get a sense of what some of the issues are that will raise a company's risk profile. And it's my recommendation to any company listening that as you think about the compliance approach you want to take, first and foremost, think about that risk profile. Sit down with others in the company. It's not a one-person initiative. Sit down with people from legal, finance, internal controls, IT, human resources, and the C-suite to really work through what that risk profile could be in the corruption and fraud area. The chapter that I focused on, which I think is of particular importance, is managing third parties. We've seen both from the Canadian perspective and the United Nations perspective, U.S. perspective, sorry, that most cases of corruption that have been brought in concern the use of third parties. It is often a lot easier to train employees and make sure that employees abide by policies and procedures, understand your culture, tone at the top. They all have the same goal in the company. It's often difficult, though, to rein in third parties. And again, as I said earlier, third parties can be in any number of areas. If it's a third party that's going to be selling your product to a government entity, maybe a state-owned hospital on your behalf, that's a much higher risk than if it's a lawyer that you hire, also a third party, who negotiates your tax liability. And so in thinking about managing third parties, a critical piece is what we call due diligence. And that is looking into the background of your third parties. It can seem overwhelming. At time it is. If you're a company that has thousands of third parties, it's somewhat breathtaking to figure out how you do that. It can be done. There are various services out there that do very high-level due diligence that might be appropriate for less risky third parties. There are other providers out there that can do diligence for more riskier third parties, to look into deeper background checks or reputational checks. And also you take it in-house. And part of the business unit's obligations in hiring a third party is doing the adequate due diligence, making sure that that third party has the qualifications, the experience, the educational background for the job they're being hired for. If they don't, then clearly that third party should not be hired. So you also need to have someone who will oversee the person who actually engages third parties, and that should be a different person. I'll give you an example here. And again, the e-book lays out better than I could examples of these situations where greater review might be important. For example, as I mentioned, a third party that solicits sales or promotes companies' products on behalf of the customer is riskier than someone who's a dealer and compensated based on a label. A local sales agent with authority to negotiate a sales contract with a foreign government poses different risks than a global law firm. You need to really think about what your third parties are doing for you and bucket them into, what I often say is red, green, and yellow, high, medium, and low categories of risk for your third parties. And then implement a very, if not detailed, a robust due diligence program where you're not just doing due diligence as you hire somebody, but you're making sure that that third party agrees in writing not to break any anti-corruption laws, agrees in writing to allow you to come in and do an internal audit if it's in fact needed, agrees in writing not to hire subcontractors without your approval. Those type of limitations that you place on a third party are very, very important, not just because you need to know what the third party is doing, but also if in fact something arises, a problem arises, and you are investigated by the government, whether it's U.S. or Canadian or elsewhere, they will ask you, what type of due diligence do you have? And what are the controls over your third parties? If you can at least demonstrate that you have a program in place, that you conduct due diligence, that you even explore internal audits, third-party audits, at least that shows the government that you've got a compliance program in place. Not every problem can be identified, but if the program has an approach that will identify more and remediate them as they occur, I think you're in a good position. With that, I will take a breath. I don't know how much more time I have. Helle? Can I keep going?
No, you cannot.
Okay.
I think we'll stop there for now. And I'm trying. Jonathan, can you hear me? You can probably hear me. Can I hear you is the question. No? I can hear something now. Pat? I know, Jonathan. I can
Helle?
hear you. Yes.
Helle, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Well, I'm here.
Fantastic. Well, we will have to have Jonathan as the last now. So, Pat, why don't you go?
Okay. Well, it's always technical difficulties when you're dealing with such technology. But I welcome the opportunity to talk to you all. But I took umbrage to Helle's description that you don't want to invite me because, yes, I represent the RCMP. We are the federal police that enforces the CFPOA, but my role, my primary role, is actually doing outreach. So it's to help companies mitigate their risk and exposure to corruption. So I would like to think that you'd like to invite me because I'm there to actually help companies succeed in global markets. If you can advance the slide, please. Again, next one. So basically my role, and put it in context that the RCMP is there to enforce the CFPOA. But really what's important to understand is that we're there because we are part of the global network and the global compact where all the conventions that many countries have signed to address the problem of corruption. Part of our role, of course, is enforcement. But really the most effective way to deal with corruption is to prevent it. And really, if you look at it from a global perspective, is that now the business environment around the world has changed dramatically. If you simply look at the headlines from FIFA, Panama Papers, Petrobras, and others, you have a plethora of headlines that outline the fact that more and more companies are being caught into the web of corruption because there's much more enforcement. There's much more global pushback from civil society against corruption. So companies need to recognize and realize now that there's greater demand for transparency and accountability in business dealings. So it's much harder today to hide, illegal activity. It's still happening. It will still happen. But I think there's a change in the business environment that is growing. And because of the global efforts against corruption, I think it's incumbent upon companies to protect themselves from the risks and mitigate their risk when they operate in high-risk jurisdictions. So when we look at the cooperation in terms of enforcement, when I talk to companies about our role, the role of the RCMP, the mandate of the RCMP, I'm not just speaking for the RCMP, because what's happening around the world is that we're collaborating very closely with the multitude of jurisdictions out there to try to curb, to try to address the problem of corruption. Is the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, which includes the US, the UK, Australia, and us. And we also work with other jurisdictions. But this is to say that it is much easier for us to investigate these things because of the easy cooperation with other enforcement agencies. So it's harder to hide those type of activities. And with the advent of the internet, what's interesting is that you have countries where people have trouble getting running water or electricity, but many of them have smartphones. And with the advent of technology, the immediacy of the information being propagated is that it's much harder for companies and people and foreign officials to hide illegal activities. So we get a lot of information on these things. So I think what's important is to underline the fact that companies operating in high-risk jurisdiction must protect themselves from the fact that perhaps in some jurisdiction they will be approached for a bribe. So how do they prevent it? How do they deal with it? And I think it's important to emphasize that we're not simply looking at companies themselves. One of the emphasis that's happening now across the world in terms of enforcement is that we are going after individuals and not just companies. So those individuals involved in the illegal activities, those individuals that transgress the policy of the companies are the ones that we're looking after. And those are the ones that we seek. So in looking at how best companies can protect themselves, it is what the e-book is offering, a compliance program, an anti-corruption compliance program. So having the right controls in place, having the right systems in place to be able to mitigate those risks and consequences. Because it's not simply the cost related to a possible criminal prosecution. It's just a business cost associated to all this. And I'm not going to go through litany of it, but it is huge cost associated simply from reputational risk, from legal cost risk, from an enormous array of risks that are associated on top of the criminal prosecution that can occur. So what's important for companies to remember when we investigate, one of the things that we look for and is the fact, does the company have the system and controls in place to have prevented this activity from occurring in the first place? So if you look just at Canada, United States, UK has Section 7. So if you don't prevent in the UK bribery, if you don't have a compliance program, you can be charged for that. In Canada, it's simply criminal prosecution. But what we are seeing, what we are seeking when we investigate is, does the company have a compliance program? Because it shows negligence. It shows culpability if they do not. So by taking the time to develop, to implement a robust compliance program, not only does the company protect themselves in terms of business practices, in terms of having the due diligence for third party, in terms of just putting themselves at risk, but it demonstrates if something happens and the RCMP comes in to investigate, when a company has a robust compliance program, it helps mitigate that investigation, that risk of prosecution. And it was mentioned by Nina, it was mentioned by Yolanda, how important that process is. And I can tell you that even though we only have a prosecutorial system in Canada at this point, we do take into account when a company has a robust compliance program. So there is a possible declination or some credit that is provided for the company that clearly demonstrate that they did everything possible to mitigate their risk, that they obviously had a very, very strong program in place, but that human nature, what it is, an individual within the company paid a bribe. So in that case, the RCMP or the law enforcement agency will look after the individual and not the company. So the power of a robust compliance program affords a lot of protection from a business perspective and an investigative perspective, and also from a prosecution perspective. So, you know, the cost and consequences in today's environment of not having a compliance program are very, very large. And it's not looking at, a company shouldn't look at it as simply as an expense line, because really a compliance program is an investment in mitigating risk, and it's an investment in a business advantage and business protection. It's like an insurance, if you wish. And what we found thus far with some companies that we work with from a prevention and outreach perspective is that a lot of them are telling us that it's actually a competitive business advantage to have a compliance program, because it affords them greater flexibility for M&As and joint ventures to demonstrate how ethical they are, what kind of governance they have, and the fact that they can protect the investment properly with a strong compliance program. You have to, companies must understand that within the CFPOA, within the laws of Canada, the RCMP has transnational jurisdiction. So what we're looking for and what we can target is the fact that any Canadian company, any Canadian individual, any Canadian resident, and also foreign citizens that are working for a Canadian company can be targeted in our investigation. And what's important to put in context in terms of the offense itself is that we do not have to prove that money was exchanged to lay a charge and convict. All we have to do is to prove that there was a conspiracy. So two senior individuals within the company agreeing to pay a bribe, that by itself is an offense. So that puts that in context. And really in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that we want companies, Canadian companies, to succeed. So I'd rather going through your door to help you mitigate that risk and offer you my expertise to help in terms of promoting this ebook and promoting compliance, as opposed to coming into the door to investigate. So if companies invest to protect their future and their business, that's the relationship we'd like to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And we'll see if we can get Jonathan on one more time. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Aparna, can you hear me now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
That's unbelievable. Well, I really apologize for the technological glitches and complications, and I'll certainly wrap up. It was inspiring and tremendous to hear from our panelists, each of whom obviously represents an important different discipline and stakeholder group when we think about anti-corruption and how it impacts all of us socially, and certainly I want to extend my own gratitude to the Government of Canada, Alexandra and Pat. You heard from both of them in terms of their leadership that has been shown in the area of anti-corruption. As Helle started with, corruption is one of the scourges that we all still confront on a global basis, regardless of whether you're in the business community, civil society, government or local communities, and eradicating it is something we all play an important role in, and that very much includes business, not just because of the risks that it poses to businesses when you cross the line, but also in terms of the mission of the Global Compact, which is ensuring just and peaceful societies. And so as we think about this ebook and the need for it, it really comes along with this effort, this global effort in which Canada has been a leader in terms of trying to prevent and eliminate corruption in all of its forms. The working group that we put together to help create this book was composed of leading thinkers from different areas. You heard from several of them, including Nina, who talked about third parties, and Yolanda from EDC, and Pat from the RCMP. I also want to acknowledge Sue Morris, who is now at Good to Great, which is a consulting company, as well as John Vanderbeek from Kinross, Chief Compliance Officer of Kinross. And the working group reached out to experts in different disciplines to write each individual chapter. So what you have here is a collection of advice and thoughts in bite-sized and easily accessed forms from the leading thinkers providing advice within Canada. And it starts with a chapter on the jurisdictional scope of the law from Stéphane Elgerat from the Davies Ward firm. It talks about how to structure a program and different ways to think about structuring a program from Peter Brady and John Buscariol at McCarthy's. It has Tone from the Top, and you heard a bit about Tone from the Top from Nina, and Peter Dent and Gina Campbell from Deloitte provided that. Training and thinking about how to provide training to employees. Ray Haywood at PwC contributed that chapter. The internal investigations chapter, and I think our first upcoming presentation, which I'll talk about in a minute, is from Mark Morrison and Michael Dixon at Blake's to talk about the investigation when you have potential issues, and as you see on the screen, July 13th is the date for that webinar. Testing on books and records, Zane Raheel of Ernst & Young contributed that chapter. Stefan Hoffman talk about policies in his chapter, which is something that I assisted on, and you heard about Nina on third parties, Nina Gross from BDO. I also contributed a chapter on risk assessments and identifying the risks in your program. The book is meant to be a resource. It is going to grow over time. We have a second set of chapters planned that deal with specific country risks that will be coming out. To the extent there are changes in the legal landscape or the factual landscape, the book, because it is an ebook, it can be updated, and updates will be found on the Global Compact Network website. And the book is up on the Global Compact Network website now. Over the course of the next several months, we will be, as I alluded to, and as Helle mentioned at the outset, we'll be scheduling additional specific subject matter webinars and presentations and other types of meetings where the chapters of these authors will be running through the salient points and helping provide additional training and thoughts for companies and other interested parties on those aspects of an anti-corruption compliance program. And so those will be announced in the coming weeks, and so please do look for that. Please do use the book as a resource, as you've heard from our other speakers, and if there are additional thoughts on the ebook, how it can be more effectively presented or used, or different kinds of events that might be held around it, please reach out to Aparna and to Helle for thoughts around that. With that, we are at a point where if there are questions on that have come out of the presentation or on the ebook, I think the panelists will be welcome to hear, very welcome to take those questions and answer them. And so, Aparna, with that, I don't know if there are questions, but perhaps we can open the line to that.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We have a lot of questions that have come in throughout the presentations. I'm going to start reading some out. The first question is to Yolanda, and the question is from Alan Franklin. He asks, There are many countries in which it is almost impossible to conduct business without paying bribes. Recent articles regarding India have suggested that bribe demands at the lower levels of government are far worse than they have ever been, and you cannot obtain a government permit without bribes. Will you refuse to insure or lend a company that is going into that market? So Yolanda, I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Yolanda. Do you want to answer that?
Hi. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Alan, for the question. Excellent question, and one that we're regularly asked. I would say that the fact that bribes are commonly paid at lower levels in India is an excuse. An excuse that you do not have to succumb to. And one thing I certainly would recommend for any company operating in India is engage with your business association, the Indo-Canada Chamber of Commerce, locally on the ground, confront the issue, say what can we do, what are best practices to avoid these kinds of payments. Just to clarify EDC's position, we're not a naming, shaming, blaming organization. What we are trying to do is work with companies to develop these kinds of solutions. It's great to acknowledge that the situation is extant in India. It's not a lost cause, however, and companies don't have to succumb. If at the end of the day a company does its risk analysis and they feel they cannot operate in a given jurisdiction without paying bribes, then comes the time when they really have to self-assess, should we stay in the market. But no, it isn't a barrier to us supporting companies in the market, nor is it a barrier for companies operating successfully. I think that companies have creative solutions that they can employ if they do not succumb to a prima facie, oh, there's nothing I can do about it, therefore I must proceed in this manner. Absolutely not.
Thank you, Yolanda. That was a very fantastic answer to a fantastic question. We have the next questions for Sergeant Poitevin, and the question is, with the increased emphasis on investigating and prosecuting individuals, is there not a risk that companies engaged in corrupt activities seek out scapegoats in an effort to cover up its activities? Pat, I'm going to unmute you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Well, when we start an investigation on any allegation, it's easy from just historical context for any company that is involved in this type of activity to look at a scapegoat. But what I can assure you is we don't take an allegation or suspicion that is provided by a company says, you know, it's this individual only that did this. We are after truth. So when there's an investigation, when there's an allegation, an accusation, we investigate thoroughly to find out the full context of those allegations to see if there's anybody else involved. Because at one point, especially when there's a bribe involved, well, somebody has to sign off on it. Nobody works as an island, and they report to somebody else. So we try to determine the extent of the involvement, not only the individual, but all the managers and everybody else involved. So at the end of the day, we make that assessment to see if it's just the individual or if it's a group of people within the company, and then we act accordingly. Every case is different, but no, we are very conscious that some people, some managers, some companies may want to just use a scapegoat. But when we say that we're more after individuals, it's just historically, especially with the United States, you know, they were going after companies for large fines. So what has been happening in the last year and will be happening now into the future is that we're going after those individuals that are making decisions to pay the bribe.
Thank you, Pat, and I have the next question. I'm not sure if Alexandra is still here. Alexandra, the next question's for, oh, perfect. I'm going to read out the question for you. The question is, will the government go to bat for a Canadian company that is having problems with bribe demands by taking it up with that foreign government, or is there a reluctance by our government to get involved because it also brings international diplomacy issues into the mix? It's a great question.
It is a great question. I mean, I think the approach that the government has to take abroad, indeed, you know, diplomatic considerations are always going to be there. You know, we make very clear that we have high expectations of our Canadian companies abroad, and in terms of dealing and conveying, messages are conveyed to other governments, you know, generally in sort of high level, in general terms, in order not to overly offend, but it also in the same way to convey a message accurately in a diplomatic manner. I mean, it'd be hard for me to say without a specific instance, but I mean, it is certainly something that the government can and will bring to the attention of other governments. So it has to be handled very carefully, but it can certainly raise concerns.
Thank you, Alexandra. The next question that I have is for, I guess, Nina. The question is, what types of disclosure can investors look at to be assured that a company has adequate anti-corruption management systems and due diligence processes in place to manage corruption risks? How can we tell from public disclosure that a compliance program is robust? Would you have any examples of best practice disclosures in Canada or elsewhere? Nina, I'm just going to unmute you now.
That's a very interesting question, and unfortunately there is nothing you can find in public disclosures. This is a type of situation where you actually have to ask a company. Sometimes they're not willing to share it, but more and more these days they are. And ask very directly whether it's a company that you're doing business with or propose to do business with, a company that you are thinking of acquiring or selling to, a company that might be a joint venture partner or a vendor or other service provider. You have to be very direct in your questions to them about what kind of compliance program do they have around anti-corruption, what type of controls they have in place, if they conduct due diligence, if they do training of employees and third parties. There are a number of really, aside from the ebook, which hopefully you will read, which has some great examples of the type of indicia that should be in a good compliance program. There are other great resources out there, including transparencyinternational.org, which will have very direct questionnaires and surveys and even examples of the types of compliance programs that companies should have. And I think based on that information, you can ask questions of those companies. But unfortunately, from a disclosure perspective, nothing is available in the public arena. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Nina. And then I have one more question for the government. So Alexandra, it's for you. The question is, what is the best way to inform trade commissioners in the region of bad practices from Canadian companies working overseas without breaking confidentiality code?
Well, I mean, I have to be clear that the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, the CFPOA, requires that Canadian government officials report any allegations of corruption they hear. So that's and it's a law that applies to Canadian businesses operating abroad, and we have an important role to in ensuring that act is carried out. Trade commissioners should have advice. I mean, they have a good knowledge of the business and operating environments, and if companies facing problems in how they're operating, they should have good advice on how you might be able to work with other entities, business associations. I know Yolanda mentioned chambers of commerce, to work together to create a stronger force to resist that, and a kind of a critical mass. So I would definitely advise approaching them for advice on operating in tough environments for that reason. And they should be in a position to provide you know, some helpful direction based on their knowledge of the environment.
Perfect. Thank you, Alexandra. And with that, we are actually up on the hour. And I wanted to thank everybody who's here with us today. Special thanks to our panelists, and I apologize for the technical difficulties we were having before. But I hope that you all found this session really interesting. And as mentioned by Jonathan and Helle, we will have upcoming sessions every month. If you're interested in registering, please get in touch with me. My email will be found on the website www.globalcompact.ca, and we will be able to assist you further. And if you have any further questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to send them to me, and I can forward it to the right person. And yeah, we look forward to having you all on our coming sessions. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, panelists.